A few months ago I got a very interesting comment from garten.zwerg. So far I gathered from your videos. The Kriegsmarine was insufficient. The Luftwaffe was insufficient. And the aces are overrated. Operation Sealion was a doomed operation. Operation Barbarossa was a doomed operation. Nazi engineering is extremely overrated and the Wehrmacht was in no way as technologically advanced as thought. Germans were almost always outnumbered and Blitzkrieg didn't exist or was in a sense an extremely old-fashioned style of warfare. To me this begs the question, how did the Nazi conquer most of Europe then? How can you be so inept but successful at the same time? Very interesting question and it covers a lot of ground. So, first off, the Kriegsmarine. The Kriegsmarine wasn't insufficient. It was just not ready, which makes complete sense because naval strategy is build strategy. You need several years or even better more decades to build up a proper navy. And since the Treaty of Versailles was in place for a long time, the Germans didn't build up a navy. I think the limitation was for a ship with at most 10,000 tons. So the Kriegsmarine couldn't be in there. So there's whatever you take. About the Luftwaffe, it was basically overstretched. The Luftwaffe was very good for the beginning of the war and from that it was basically created from scratch in the early 30s. And Göring did in this aspect a very good job at building up a Luftwaffe rather fast. But there was one thing, the build-up was made with certain trade-offs. For instance, they put more into putting out planes instead of building factories. And also they had very different types and mass production, everything was lagging behind. Then also Göring did a very bad job at promoting the right people. He promoted mostly mediocre people and other stuff and hindered the Luftwaffe in many other ways. So this is quite a complicated aspect and it was at a certain point, if you fight a multi-front war against the largest powers in the world, well, you get overwhelmed. Then the aces were and are not overrated. It's the main problem that people interpret in the kill-death ratio way too much into it and don't look at the context that it happened and that it's completely not a useful way to use a kill-death ratio in an industrial warfare environment. A kill-death ratio makes sense in a computer game where you have a very restricted area, a very small aspect and almost no influence from outside. You don't have reliability issues with your plane. There's no flak and other elements that can kill you. Yeah, then a kill-death ratio can make a certain aspect, but it also tells you about one person or a few people, but not the whole system. This is the main issue also for the other aspects. You have several layers. You have the tactical layer, you have the operational layer, you have the strategic layer, and you have the grand strategic layer. And everyone performed differently at certain layers. This is why, for instance, certain people say, oh, the Germans were ace. Yeah, usually the Germans were ace on the tactical and operational level. But on the strategic level and the grand strategic level, they lacked due to leadership, resources, location and other aspects. And this is what most people can switch between the layers and say, okay, yeah, here this was good and this was bad. Also time changed a lot of stuff. But back to the points. Sealion was a doomed operation, yes. But actually, there's a book which I might read at one point about Sealion out there. There was actually quite a chance of success. I didn't read it because beforehand I wanted to do my video why Sealion couldn't be a success. Because then I already have a background knowledge for that, and then when I read the book I can already apply my knowledge prior to that. So would be probably an interesting read. Then Operation Barbarossa, doomed. In the way it was conducted, definitely. It was conducted as a short operation and overly optimistic to every point, similar to Case Blue, which ended in Stalingrad. I guess I don't need to tell you that this wasn't a good ending for the Wehrmacht. And this is the issue, the thing is, for a long time there was always like Barbarossa was a close call, where many people claimed that. And I think the latest years and decades, it was a doomed operation from the start. And I assume that it wasn't as close as some of the early ones wrote, but if it was as doomed is the other question. Because from that, how it was conducted and everything, yes. But if you take a few other elements away, it could have gone another way, or at least to a stalemate on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, with beating the Soviet Union till winter 1941, yes, doomed operation. Defeating the Soviet Union in general, well, bit more complicated if you change a few parameters. I'm not sure, it could be also, I'm not entirely sure, it could be that it is a doomed operation from every aspect, but the thing is, a lot of books, I think, were written from this premise it was a doomed operation from the beginning, whereas previously the books were often written from the perspective it was a close call. And usually you end up with that. So, and it would be interesting what the next 10, 20 years bring on the future of Operation Barbarossa. So, Nazi engineering, well, I just talk about the terminology. I don't know when the M1 Abrams was built or designed, but this is a Republican or a Democratic tank. I'm not sure. And does it count when it was, because I assume there was a change in government a few times. So what is the determining terminology here? Is it which president was in charge, or is it about Congress, or is it about when the tank was introduced, or when he was first given in development? So yeah, and the thing is about now back to the serious part, about the rockets and jets, they were too early. Rockets, at least strategic rockets, made no sense at that point for conducting effective warfare. And jets are not like a small increment in the whole development circle. It's a huge leap. And for a huge leap, you need the logistics, you need the production capability, you need the resources, you need the engineers. You need a lot of stuff. Basically nothing Germany had in abundance. They had a lack of engineers, they had a lack of resources. I mean, they had to create a new alloy several times because they didn't have enough heat-resistant metal around. So then about Blitzkrieg. Basically, why it was so successful, although it was basically old-style Prussian warfare or German warfare. Well, because the Allies were to a certain degree inept. And nobody was thinking about that. And also the Germans were highly trained and highly determined at that point in time. And this is also the reason for the other aspect, where we go back to the technical and operational level. The Germans were well trained on the technical and operational level. They had also a lot of experience. They had the Spanish Civil War, they had the Sudetenland crisis, and they had the Anschluss. It's something completely different to move your tanks around in the maneuver ground or to drive into Austria, even if there's a shot fired. But for instance, their tanks broke down. When your tank breaks down in the maneuver, well, you don't care as much, or it's not that problematic. If your tank breaks down between Linz and Vienna and you are left behind, or then you need to determine, same with the logistics company there, or keeps it on going to Vienna. And then you have to think about how to solve certain problems. And then if you invade Poland, you already solved most of these problems. Whereas the Allies probably hadn't any experience in this. So when they used the tanks for the first time and somebody broke down, they had to still figure out what to do next. So this is the same. You learn a lot of stuff by experience. In theory, everything is easy. What I learned from startups and everything, basically every question which you think is hard in a startup, usually if in execution it's quite easy, and every question you thought is quite easy, in execution in theory, is actually in execution can sometimes be a pain in the ass. And I assume in military affairs it's similar the same way. So, and then the Germans had already the experience from pre-war And then in the war, since they were highly analytical and looked at everything, they increased even more. So on the tactical and operational level, they were highly experienced, they're good NCOs and officers corps. And so the early victories, they could improve on them. But on the strategic and grand strategic level, they lacked the staying power. And for instance, since the Germans were that good at certain levels, the Allies had to catch up fast. And you learn a lot if you play against a stronger enemy. I mean, if you play against a way stronger enemy in a computer game, you probably will just end for frustration. But in a world war, you can't quit. So you will step up your game. And the Allies did a great job at this. So this is why the whole dynamic from the early German victories, where they seemed invincible in contrast, but also if you look at the loss numbers, they were clearly not invincible. This whole change makes to a certain degree no sense, but if you look at the context and the different factors at work, it's at a certain point, it's just, yeah, it's completely logical. It's just the dynamic changes. At certain points, the Wehrmacht gets eroded too much, the others stepped up their game, the resources weren't sufficient anymore, and the whole thing was overstretched. Whereas the others were getting better and getting more troops and material to the front. So, this hopefully explains how a force can be inept at a certain degree, but still very successful. Because it wasn't inept, just there were certain flaws at certain points. And the success was also to a certain degree determined by the flaws of the enemies, because they were not ready at this point. So I hope this answered the question, and thank you for watching, and see you next time.